Western leaders privately admit that Ukraine cannot win the war. Authored by Joe Loria via Consortium News on Zero Hedge. Western leaders privately told Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky that Ukraine cannot win the war against Russia and that it should begin peace talks with Moscow this year in exchange for closer ties with NATO. Now, Elysee Palace, where Macron and Scholz told Zelensky to seek peace, the private communications are at odds with public statements from Western leaders who routinely say they will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes until it achieves victory on the battlefield. The Wall Street Journal, which reported on the private remarks to Zelensky, said, "The public rhetoric masks deepening private doubts among politicians in the UK, France, and Germany that Ukraine will be able to expel the Russians from eastern Ukraine and Crimea, which Russia has controlled since 2014, and belief that the West can only help sustain the war effort for so long, especially if the conflict settles into a stalemate," officials from the three countries said. A senior French official said, "We keep repeating that Russia must not win, but what does that mean? If the war goes on for long enough with this intensity, Ukraine's losses will become unbearable," he said, "and no one believes they will be able to retrieve Crimea." French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz told Zelensky at the Elysee Palace dinner earlier this month that he must consider peace talks with Moscow, the journal reported, and according to its source, the newspaper quoted Macron as telling Zelensky that even mortal enemies like France and Germany had to make peace after World War II. Macron told Zelensky he had been a great war leader, but that he would eventually have to shift into political statesmanship and make difficult decisions, the newspaper said. At the Munich Security Conference last week, General Peter Pavel, a Czech Republic president-elect and a former NATO commander, said, "We may end up in the situation where liberating some parts of Ukrainian territory may deliver more loss of lives than will be bearable by society. There may be a point where Ukrainians can start thinking about another outcome." Even when he was a NATO commander, Pavel was a realist in regarding to Russia. During controversial NATO war games with 31,000 troops on Russia's borders in 2016, the first time in 75 years that German troops had retracted the steps of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, Pavel dismissed hype about a Russian threat to NATO. Pavel, who was chairman of NATO's military committee at the time, told a Brussels press conference that it is not the aim of NATO to create a military barrier against broad-scale Russian aggression, because such an aggression is not on the agenda and no intelligent assessment suggests such a thing, he said. The German foreign minister at the time, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, also embraced realism towards Russia, saying, "What we should not do now is inflame the situation further through saber-rattling and warmongering. Whoever believes that a symbolic tank parade on the alliance's eastern border will bring security is mistaken." Instead of an aggressive NATO stance towards Russia that could backfire, Steinmeier called for a dialogue with Moscow. "We are well advised," he said, "to not create pretexts to renew an old confrontation." This is what he said, saying it would be fatal to search only for military solutions and a policy of deterrence. Under US leadership, NATO clearly did not follow that advice, as it continued to deploy more troops to Eastern Europe and to arm and train Ukraine under cover of pretending to back the Minsk Accords. And before its intervention in Ukraine, Russia cited NATO's eastward expansion, the deployment of missiles in Romania and Poland, war games near its borders, and the arming of Ukraine as red lines with the West that the West had crossed. After a year of war, Western leaders appear now to be turning to a realistic approach. Macron of France, for instance, at the Munich Security Conference, dismissed any talk of regime change in Moscow. No U.S. reaction, though. Washington has not commented on the journal's story about the peace talks for arms proposal. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken last month discussed with the Washington Post arming Ukraine post-war, but he did not say that Ukraine should seek peace talks. We have to be thinking, and we are, about what the post-war future looks like to ensure that we have a security and stability for Ukrainians and security and stability in Europe, Blinken told the conference in Munich. The proposal to bring Ukraine even closer to NATO than it already is, with greater access to weapons after the war, should be on the agenda at NATO's annual meeting in July, said Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister of Britain, at the Munich conference. The NATO summit must produce a clear offer to Ukraine, also to give Zelensky a political win that he can present at home as an incentive for negotiations, a British official told the Journal. The deal with NATO would not include membership with its Article 5 protection, the newspaper reported. They said, "We would like to have security guarantees on the path to NATO," Zelensky told press conference on Friday. In the meantime, Macron, according to the Wall Street Journal report, said that Ukraine should press forward with a military offensive to regain territory in order to push Moscow to the peace table. There has been no reaction from Moscow about the proposal. Political analyst Alexander Mercouris, in the video report on Saturday, said Russia would likely be incentivized to continue fighting rather than enter peace talks, with the knowledge that Ukraine would be heavily armed by NATO after the war. Mercouris said the Russians are never going to agree with something like this. They must be saying to themselves that instead of agreeing to this plan, it actually makes more sense to continue this war. One of Russia's objectives is the total demilitarization of Ukraine. What the Western powers are proposing is the opposite, he said. Given that Russia considers it is winning, and there seems to be a general acknowledgement among Western governments that Ukraine cannot win this war, where is the incentive for Russia to even consider this plan? For Moscow, Mercouris said, Ukraine's demilitarization is an absolute existential matter. If Ukraine is going to get even more advanced weapons from NATO after the war, as opposed to what it would get whilst the war is still underway, then it makes even less sense for Russia to stop the war and agree to this plan. Russia is facing a weakening adversary now, Mercouris said, and Moscow clearly prefers that to facing a strengthening adversary later on. And that makes sense, of course. And this is by Zerahedge, authored by Joe Loria via Consortium News. What do you think about this? Please leave your comments. Thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support, and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box.